We are holding in the middle of Seif, in the second paragraph of Seif, of the Maamer, Chukas Tavshin. In the last year, the Rebbe introduced the idea of Tefillah l'Moshe. There's a kapitel in Tehillim, kapitel Tzadik, that starts off Tefillah l'Moshe. That Moshe has a Tefillah, Moshe has a prayer. And it's explained in the Zohar, the Rebbe brought the Zohar in Sif Dalid, that the Tefillah of Moshe is a Tefillah's Asher. It's a Tefillah, it's a request and a prayer that is davened specifically by an Asher, by a wealthy person. So the Rebbe brought a Maamer of the Rebbe Rashab, in which the Rebbe Rashab asks, what does it mean that there's a Tefillah l'Moshe, a Tefillah's Asher? What does it mean that Moshe has a Tefillah? What does it mean that an Asher, that a rich person has a Tefillah? Tefillah by definition means that you are davening, you are asking for the Eibusher to fulfill, to provide you with your needs. That the Eibusher should provide you with what you are lacking. And an Asher by definition is a person that is not lacking anything. So what does it mean that an Asher, what does it mean that Moshe has a Tefillah? Now, in order to properly explain this question, the Rebbe introduced from the Maamer of the Rebbe Rashab that when speaking of the sugya, the topic of anius and ashirus, wealth and poverty, there are three dargas, three levels, or there are three categories when we're discussing this sugya, this topic of anius and ashirus. What are the three categories? The first category is a person that has his most basic and essential needs, or a person that's lacking his most basic and essential needs. That's all the first category. A person that we're discussing his most basic and essential needs. Even a person that has his most basic and essential needs is still called an ani. He's still a poor person. As long as he's lacking something, as long as he does not have what he's accustomed to, as long as a person is lacking the lifestyle, he's missing from the lifestyle that he was once accustomed to, this person is called an ani, he's called a poor person. That's the first level. The second level is a person that not only does he have his most basic and essential needs, he even has everything that he was used to, everything that he's accustomed to. He's living the full lifestyle that he was ever accustomed to. He has a sus lirkev olav, ve'evid laretz lefanav, he has a fancy horse, he has servants, etc. Such a person is still not considered an usher. He's not considered wealthy. Although he's not lacking anything, although he has his essential needs, he has everything he's accustomed to, but he's still not considered an usher. An usher, a rich person, a wealthy person, is specifically a person that is mushpa b'ribuy ashpa, a person that has an abundance, a person that has more than he is ever accustomed to. Only a person that has more ashpa, only a person that possesses more than what he is expected to have is considered an usher, is considered a wealthy person. So these are the three categories. A person that only has his most basic and essential needs, but he's lacking that which he was once accustomed to. There's a person that has not only his basic and essential needs, but he has everything he was ever accustomed to, but he's still not an usher. And an usher is a person that has his essential needs, he has everything he was ever accustomed to, and he has even more than expected, more than what he naturally would be expected to have. That is considered an usher. Now here in Seif, the Rebbe is going to explain that we already mentioned this idea in the last year, that by Moshe Rabbeinu there's no differentiation between his physical status and his spiritual status. By Moshe we cannot differentiate. Moshe leipsik time begavai. There's no differentiation. The Zohar explains that Moshe Rabbeinu is a person that we cannot differentiate. We cannot make any difference, any differentiation between the way he existed here in this physical world and the way he existed in his makar, in his source. There's no difference between the two ways of existence. So therefore, if Moshe was physically wealthy, that tells us that Moshe was an Asher Baruchnis. He was spiritually wealthy. And being that he was spiritually wealthy, that was expressed also here in this physical world. That's why he was physically wealthy. So what does it mean that Moshe was spiritually wealthy? That's what the Rebbe is going to come to explain here in the rest of Seif. What does it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu was an Osher Beruchnius and therefore automatically also an Osher Begashmis? Here's where the Rebbe is going to introduce the three concepts of Memale, the three dargas of Memale, Seif, and Atzmus. Very briefly, we're going to explain this idea a little bit more at length after we read the Sif inside, but briefly, Atzmus refers to the very essence of the Eibishter, the way the Eibishter exists in his very essence. Or a Seif is the way the Eibishter reveals, the way the Eibishter expresses himself in an infinite manner. And our Memale is the way the Eibishter expresses himself in a limited manner. That's Memale, Seif, and Atzmus. And the Rebbe is going to explain how these three dargas correspond to the three dargas, to the three levels of Aniyos and Ashirus, of poverty and wealth. Let's read a little bit of the second paragraph of Seif inside, and then we will explain. We are holding in the second paragraph by the words Al Pi Mashakasav Le'il. Says the Rebbe inside, Al Pi Mashakasav Le'il, Tezeh Shemei Shaya Asher Begashmis, Hu Lefi Shaya Asher Beruchniis. We explained before in the first paragraph of Seif that why was Moshe wealthy? Why was he an Asher Begashmis, a physical Asher? Is because he was spiritually wealthy. So says the Rebbe, move on, it's understood from this. From this it's understood that in addition to the fact that Moshe was not lacking anything, what does it mean he wasn't lacking anything spiritually? Says the Rebbe, why was Moshe not lacking anything? Because by Moshe there was the Gili, by Moshe there was the revelation of Ur HaMemali and of Ur HaSeviv, which both Ur HaMemali and Ur HaSeviv are not considered wealth. They are considered Miliach Hasarin. They are considered that the Eibishter is filling, the Eibishter is providing you with your needs. Both the Gili of Ur HaMemali and the Gili of Ur HaSeviv, even the Gili of Ur HaSeviv is only what we call Miliach Hasarin. Miliach Hasarin means that the Eibishter is providing you with your needs, with what you're lacking. It's not considered Ashiras. It's not considered wealth. Because as we just mentioned before, wealth means you have more than what your basic needs. Not only more than what your basic needs, wealth means you have even more than what you're expected to have. What you're expected to have, what you're accustomed to, is called your needs. If you don't have it, it's called that you're lacking. So Memali and Seif are both considered Miliach Hasarin. And Moshe had, the Gili had a revelation of Memali and Seif. Let's skip the brackets for a second. So again, what did we just say before the brackets? That in addition to the fact that Moshe had the Gili of Ur Memali and Ur Seif, which that's all Miliach Hasarin, skip the brackets, Heir Etze Begilui, Gam Gili, the Ur in Seif Shalamayla, Meshaychs Leilamis. In addition to the fact that by Moshe there was a Gili of Memali and Seif, there was also a revelation of the Ur that's totally beyond Eilamis. Which is basically, for right now, to simplify things, we're going to call that Atzmos, the very essence of the Eibishter. So if we're saying Moshe was an Asher, that means that not only was there a Gili of Memali and Seif by Moshe, but there was a Gili of Atzmos of the Ur and Seif that's higher than Shaychas Leilas by Moshe Rabbeinu. Here in this brackets, the Rebbe is going on to explain why it is that Memali and Seif are both considered Miliach Hasarin. Why is Memali and Seif both considered like the Eibishter is filling your needs? So before we read the brackets inside, we're just going to explain outside what the Rebbe is going to discuss in these brackets. What is the difference between Memali and Seif? So the truth is that there are many differences. Throughout Chassidus, you can find many ways of explaining, many different ways of explaining and highlighting what exactly is the difference between Memali and Seif. It depends what difference, what contrast you're trying to bring out. For our Maimer, one difference between Memali and Seif is relevant. Memali is what we call a makar le'elamis. The way the Eibishter is a source and a cause for elamis. Whereas Seif is not a makar for elamis. What does this mean? Let's take a mashal that the Rebbe is actually going to bring here in the brackets, in this Maimer. We know it says that the Eibishter created the world in the Sheish Yemei Bereishis. Sheishes Yamim Asa Vayas Shemayim V'Saretz. The Eibishter created the world in 6 days. What happened on Shabbos? On Shabbos, Vayishbeis b'yom hashvi. The Eibishter rested. What is the difference between working and resting? When a person works, a person has koiches. A person has different energies, different abilities, different capabilities to be productive and to create and to be creative in different ways. Let's say, for example, a person's a builder. He's involved in construction. A person who's involved in construction has the koyach to build and to create buildings. He has different skills and mechanics, etc., etc. And what does it mean that a person's actually going ahead and building a building? What does it mean that a person is actually working and being creative? It means that a person is taking his koiches that he possesses and he's applying them, he's using them out b'poel mamish. In other words, the person is taking the koiches that he owns, the koiches which he possesses for himself, and he's taking those koiches and he's using them, he's applying them to something outside of himself. So what's going on over here is that a person that is working has become a mucker, has become a source, he's become a cause, he's become the explanation, the reason for something outside of himself to exist, to create something new, something outside of himself. That's what happens when a person is working. When a person is working, he's taking his koiches and he's exerting himself. What does it mean he's exerting himself? He's taking the energies, he's taking the koiches and the capabilities that exist within himself, and he's using them for something, he's giving space for something outside of himself. And that's what we mean that this builder, when he is in the mode, when he's putting himself in the mode to start working, he is becoming a cause, he's becoming a source, he's becoming the reason as to why something new, something outside of himself is being built, is being created. And so too can be said with regards to the Eibishter. If the Eibishter is creating a world, if the Eibishter in the Sheishis Mei Bereishis, Sheishis Yom Asa Avaya Shemaim Varis, the Eibishter is creating. What does it mean he's creating? It means that the Eibishter is giving place, he's giving space for something outside of himself to exist, to bring something else, something other than the Eibishter into existence. So that, in other words, the Eibishter is becoming a mocker for Elamis. He's becoming the cause, he's becoming the reason as to why something other than himself will exist. And that's the idea of Ur Mamali. Ur Mamali means the way the Eibishter limited himself, the way the Eibishter decided to express himself in a limited manner. What do we mean by a limited manner? Over here we mean that the Eibishter is making place for something other than himself. That's a big limitation. Naturally, the Eibishter is infinite. When we speak about infinity, infinity means that there's no place for something other than himself. Infinite means he doesn't end. So there's no end to his existence. There's no space, not even a conceptual space, for something other than himself. That's our Seif. That's the infinity of the Eibishter. If we're saying that the Eibishter is creating a world, why is the Eibishter creating a world? It means that the Eibishter limited his revelation to being a makar l'elamis. That the Eibishter wants to be a source, he wants to be a cause, he wants to be a reason for something other than himself to exist. And that's what it means that the Eibishter is creating the world in the Sheishis Mei Bereishis. That's the idea of malacha, of working. When a person's working, he is giving place, he's giving attention, a chashivos, to something other than himself, something that exists outside of his world. And that's the same thing that the Eibishter did in the Sheishis Mei Bereishis, and that's the idea of the Gilui of Ur Mamali. That the Eibishter is a makar l'elamis. What does it mean to rest? What does it mean that the Eibishter rested on Yom HaShvi? So the word vayishbeis, to rest, is the same word, it shares the same shayresh as the idea of Shabbos, which can also mean to return. Resting, the true understanding of what it means to rest, is that your koiches are returning to yourself. When a person's working, he's exerting himself. Exerting means he's taking the koiches that belong to him and he's investing them, he's applying them to something outside of his world, something other than himself. Shvisa, menucha, the true idea of resting means that a person is returning, his koiches are returning, they're coming back to himself. He's, so to speak, retrieving his koiches. While he was working, he was investing his koiches outside of himself. When he's resting would mean that a person is bringing his koiches back to himself, he's coming back to himself. That's the idea of shvisa. And that would represent the idea of Ur Seif Kalam. Ur Mamali Kalalmin is the way the Eibishter is a makar l'elamis. The way the Eibishter is involved in creating l'elamis, giving attention, giving space, a certain chashivos to something outside of himself. What's Ar HaSeviv? Ar HaSeviv is the idea of shvisa, the idea of menucha. The Eibishter is resting. What does it really mean to rest? It means to come back to himself. The Eibishter is retrieving. So to speak, the Eibishter is taking his keiches and coming back to himself, being removed from work, being removed from giving so much attention to things outside of yourself. Just being yourself, being who you are, and being removed, being detached from the world outside of you. That's the idea of shvisa, of resting, of returning to yourself. And that is, very briefly, one of the basic differences between our mamali and our seviv. Our mamali is the Eibishter making himself be a makar le'elamis, that the Eibishter is a source, the Eibishter is a cause for the existence of elamis, for elamis, which are things that are foreign, that are other to the Eibishter. Something that's not the Eibishter, Metzias that's outside of the Eibishter, outside of Elikus. That's our mamali. Our seviv is the Eibishter that we exist, the way the Eibishter expresses himself in an infinite manner, meaning the way the Eibishter is beyond being a makar elamis. The way the Eibishter is existing, so to speak, in his natural state, the way the Eibishter is removed from giving attention, giving space for something outside of himself. However, even our seviv, although it's not a makar elamis, it's not a cause, it's not something that demands, our seviv is not a darga lekus that demands, that is giving space for something outside of himself, like our mamali. So our seviv is not a makar elamis. However, it's mavur in Chassidus, it's explained in Chassidus that our seviv is a dargan lekus that has what we call a shaychus le'elamis. It's not a makar, it's not a cause, it's not a source for elamis, but it's a darga that has some sort of a relationship and some sort of a relevance to elamis. What does this mean? So just to explain this again briefly in a very basic manner. The very fact that you could say that the person is resting in and of itself means that we're talking about a level that has a shaychus to working. Resting is the contrast of working. If you would have no shaychus to working at all, we wouldn't be able to say that you're resting. Resting is the lack, so to speak, of working. Meaning to say, if you're describing a person as resting, that means you're also describing this person as a person that has a shaychus to working. If you didn't have a shaychus to working, if you didn't have a shaychus to the idea of work in the first place, then we can't say you're resting either. The very fact that we're describing our seviv as a dargan likus, that is resting, that is in the level of menucha, that in and of itself shows that our seviv is also a darga that has some sort of a relationship to the idea of work. Although he's not working b'poil, the darga of our seviv, which is the darga of menucha, the darga of resting, when a person's resting, he's not actually working. So he's not working b'poil, or a seviv is not actually a makar. He's not a source, he's not a cause for elamis, but he's a darga that has some sort of a connection with the idea of elamis. And to explain in other words, it means that if you are living, existing the reality of our seviv, if you were living with the perspective of our seviv, that means the concept of elamis wouldn't be totally mufrach. In our seviv, there is some sort of conceptual elamis. The idea of elamis exists in our seviv. Albeit that our seviv is not a makar, it's not a source, it's a dargan lekus, it's not mechayev elamis. Our seviv is a dargan lekus that doesn't give a chashivos. He doesn't say, I see value in elamis. Our mamali is a dargan lekus that sees value to elamis. The Eibishter wants to create elamis in our mamali. Our seviv is not a darga that sees a chashivos and a value to creating elamis, but the idea, the conceptual idea of elamis exists already in our seviv. Even our seviv, even the infinity of the Eibishter does not absolutely negate the concept of elamis. The concept of elamis exists even in our seviv. Just like the concept of work exists even in resting. Although when a person's resting, he's not working. That's precisely the point. He's resting, he's not working, but the concept of work exists even in the realm of resting. Because as we said before, if there would be no concept of work, the concept of rest wouldn't exist either. Based on all this, we can understand why mamali and seviv represent the first two levels when we're discussing that there are three levels in aniyus and ashiras. There are three levels when it comes to poverty and wealth. So mamali and seviv represent the first two dargas. Why? Ur mamali is the dargan lekus that creates elamis. Ur mamali is the dargan lekus that is responsible for the existence of the world. Everything that exists here in this world is attributed to Ur mamali, because Ur mamali is the makar le'elamis. So having a gilui, having a revelation of Ur Mamali in this world can be compared and corresponds to the first level in Aniyas and Ashirus. The first level is a person that has his basic and essential needs. Ur Mamali can definitely be called the most basic and essential need of Welt. Which Dargan Lakus does the world need in order to exist? Ur Mamali. Ur Mamali is the Dargan Lakus that brings our world into existence. So Ur Mamali can be compared to a person if there's a Gili of Ur Mamali in this world, that can be compared to a person that has his basic and essential needs. Ur Mamali is the most basic and essential need for our world to exist. That's Ur Mamali. So Ur Mamali corresponds to the first Dargan. Which would basically mean, if you have a Yid that's walking around here in this world and has a realization, has that car, and he's living in the reality, he feels that the Eibishter is the one that brings every single thing into existence, that means we're talking about a certain Yid that has a revelation of Ur Mamali. He's experiencing Ur Mamali. He's living in the reality of Ur Mamali. He realizes how every single thing here in this world comes from the Eibishter. The Eibishter created it. The Eibishter is the one that's responsible for the existence of everything here in this world. So that's a Yid that's living with a Gili of Ur Mamali, and such a Yid, we wouldn't call him an usher. He's not an usher, he's not a wealthy person. He's a Yid that has the most basic and essential needs, the revelation of Ur Mamali. But then there's Ur HaSeviv. Ur HaSeviv, we would not call Ur HaSeviv the basic and essential needs of the world, because the world does not come from Ur Mamali. From Ur HaSeviv, sorry. Ur HaSeviv is not the Dargan Likus that is responsible for the existence of our world. However, even though Ur HaSeviv is not the Dargan Likus that is responsible for the existence of the world, but as we just explained before, even Ur HaSeviv is a Dargan Likus that has some sort of a shaykhis to Eilamis. The concept of Eilamis does exist in some conceptual form in Ur HaSeviv. Even the infinity of the Eibishter, even when we speak about the Bli Gvul Likus, it does not absolutely and totally negate the concept of the world. And therefore, Ur HaSeviv can be compared to the second Darga in Aniyas and Ashirus. What's the second Darga? The second Darga is a person that not only does he have his basic and essential needs, he has anything he's accustomed to. What does it mean? Accustomed to means we're talking about something that's more than your basic essential needs. A person that has a sus, lirkevalav, a fancy car, that's more than your most basic and essential needs. But it's something you're accustomed to. That's Ur HaSeviv. Ur HaSeviv is beyond being a makar leilamis. Ur HaSeviv is not what creates Eilamis. It's not a makar leilamis, but it's a Dargan Likus that has a shaykhis to Eilamis. So that represents, and that corresponds, Ur HaSeviv corresponds to the second Darga in Aniyas and Ashirus. And this would mean, if you have a Yid that's walking around in the world, not only does he realize that the Eibishter created everything in the world, which is Ur Mamali, but a Yid is a Gili of Ur HaSeviv. He realizes that the truth is that the Eibishter is beyond creating the world. And creating the world is not a davar choshev by the Eibishter. A Yid that walks around such a perspective, a Yid that walks around realizing that although the world is so great and so big, but the Eibishter is even bigger. The Eibishter is even greater than the world. The Eibishter is even greater than creating the world. A Yid that walks on with such a perspective, he is walking around with a Gili, with the perspective of Ur HaSeviv. But even such a Yid is not called wealthy. He's not called spiritually wealthy. He has his basic and essential needs. He even has what he's accustomed to. He has more than his basic and essential needs. He has a Gili Likus that's beyond Eilamis, Ur HaSeviv. But he doesn't have a Gili of Ashirus. He's not wealthy. That's Mamali and Seif. Based on all of this, based on everything we just said now, we can understand why Mamali and Seif correspond to the first two Dargas in Aniyas and Ashirus. To the level of having your Miliach Asar and your basic needs, and Ur HaSeviv represents having even more than your basic needs, but you're having a Gili that is what we call at the end of the day Miliach Asar, because it's still having what you're accustomed to. You're having a Gili of a Darga that has a Shaykhis, that has some sort of a relevance to Eilamis. That's all Mamali and Seif. So what's Takashirus? What is wealth? What does it mean to be wealthy? What does it mean to be spiritually wealthy? Having a Gili that's beyond Mamali and Seif. And that's Atzmus. Atzmus is beyond Mamali and Seif. Mamali is a makar leilamis. Seif has a shaykhis leilamis. Atzmus, the very essence of the Eibishter, the way the Eibishter exists in his most essential state, means that the Eibishter has absolutely no connection and no natural relationship to the world. Like we said again, Ur HaSeviv at the end he has some sort of a shaykhis, some sort of a connection, some sort of a relationship to Eilamis. Atzmus, The way the Eibishter exists in his essence is the way the Eibishter exists in such a form that he has no connection at all, no relationship at all, not even the most subtle relationship that our Seif has to the worlds. And that's Ashirus. That's having abundance. Why is having a Gili of Atzmus having an abundance? Because Atzmus is the only level, is the only, so to speak, Dagan Likus, that has no connection and no relationship to the world at all. So you can't call Atzmus Milei Chasarn. Atzmos is not the basic and essential need of the world. And Atzmos is not even what we would call something that the world is accustomed to. Because Atzmos is something that's absolutely beyond Eilamis. So therefore, what's the idea of Ashirus? What's spiritual wealth? A Gili of Atzmos. What does a Gili of Atzmos look like? What does it mean? We said before, a Yid that's walking around with a Gili of Ramimale, he has the realization that the Eibush is creating the world. A Yid that's walking around with Seif has a realization that the Eibush is beyond. He's greater than the world. What does it mean for a Yid to have a Gili of Atzmos, of Seif, that's L'mayla M'shaychas L'Elamis? So that the Rebbe is going to explain towards the end of this paragraph the idea of Das Elin. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's first read the brackets that we skipped inside. Says the Rebbe in the brackets, the HaMemale, Kevan Shu Makar L'Elamis, L'chein, which is the source, is the cause and the reason for why our world exists. It's a makar le'elamis. So the gili of Mamali is definitely considered a basic and essential need. And if a person doesn't have the gili of Mamali, he's literally lacking. He's lacking his most essential need. That's our Mamali. V'rak shayich la'elamis, la'chen k'shein mizgala ba'elam erzeh, ha'chasarn da'elam u'dugmas ha'chasarn d'sus lirkev alav v'avid larz l'fanav. However, when it comes to Seif is not a makar le'elamis. So you can't say that a Yid that does not have a Gili of Seif is literally lacking. He's not chaser mamish, but however, he's lacking something that the world's accustomed to. Because even Seif, although it's not a makar le'elamis, but it's shayich la'elamis. Says the Rebbe is going to be a makar. The Rebbe is going to be a source over here. How do we know that even Seif is a darga that's shayach la'elamis, and if we're lacking Seif, it's still at the end of the day, in a subtle manner, it's considered that we're lacking. How do we know this? Says the Rebbe, we find this in a Maamar Azal. Maamar Azal ala posuk v'echalikim b'yim hashvi ma haya elam chaser menucha ba Shabbos ba menucha. Chazal say as follows. It says in the posuk v'echalikim b'yim hashvi, the Eibusher finished working on the seventh day. What does it mean the Eibusher finished on the seventh day? Simply the Eibusher finished before the seventh day. The Eibusher created the world in 6 days. Sheishes yamim asa v'yashmayim v'sa'aretz. So what does it mean by chalikim b'mashvi? What does it mean the Eibusher completed the work on the seventh day? So Chazal say the world was still lacking something. Even after the Eibusher created the world in the 6 days in the Sheish Mebereshis, the world was still lacking something. What was it lacking? It was lacking the idea of menucha, of rest. The Eibusher was working in all 6 days. So the concept of menucha was lacking. Ba Shabbos ba menucha. On the seventh day, the idea of menucha was introduced to the world. Says the Rebbe, what is menucha? What does it mean to rest? Menucha hi b'chinas seviv. Shalamaylim er mislabish ba'ilam. Says that we see a very interesting thing over here in this Maamar Chazal. What is menucha? Menucha represents the idea of Seif, where the Eibishter is removed from being a makar le'elamis. The Eibishter is not being productive. He's not being creative. He's not being a makar le'elamis. He's not creating the world. The im kozeh. What do Chazal say? That when there's no menucha, the elam is chaser. The elam is lacking. The elam is lacking when there's no menucha. When there's no gili of Seif, the world is still lacking. Ella says Rebbe, Shachasardin zeh, who loy shechaser is a prat biha elam atzmei, ki kol pratim da elam nishava de meleches abriya or a mislabish ba elam shenishma lefnei Shabbos. Says Rebbe, but there's a big difference between this lack, the lack of menucha, and the lack of Mamali. Why? When you're lacking Mamali, you're lacking Welt, you're lacking the world. Because the world comes from Mamali. Who is responsible for the creation of the world, for the existence of the world, is Mamali. So if you're lacking Mamali, you're lacking Meleches Ha'elam, Meleches Abri, you're lacking the world itself. If you don't have Mamali, you don't have a world. So if you don't have Mamali, that's a real chesaron. When you're lacking Menucha, you're not lacking a part of the world. You're not lacking a detail, a chilek of the world, because Menucha represents Seif. And the world is not attributed to Seif. The world does not come from Seif. So if you're lacking Seif, you're not lacking a part of the world, but you're still lacking. Why? What does it mean that you're lacking? Says Rebbe, "V'zeh sha'il me'chaser menucha hu dugmas achsar desus lirkev alav she'ein zeh davar echrech l'tzech kiyum chayusei u'k'shabas Shabbos v'nimshach nizgal er seviv nismal legam chsar zeh." So says Rebbe, so what does it mean you're lacking when there was no menucha? What does it mean the olam was chaser? The world was lacking when there was no gilei of menucha, of seviv. What does it mean it was lacking? Says Rebbe, it's dugmas. This can be compared to the idea of someone that's lacking what he was accustomed to. A sus, a horse, and avodim, and having servants running in front of you is not essential. It's not something that's necessary to your existence, to remaining alive. It's not essential. It's not a davar chrechi. But it's something you're accustomed to. And Chazal teach us that even lacking something that you are accustomed to is considered a lack. So too can be said with regards to Ur HaSeviv, although Ur HaSeviv is not a makar le'elamis. The world does not come from Ur HaSeviv. The world comes from Ur HaMamali. But even if there's a lack, if there's no Gilei of Menucha, if Ur HaSeviv is not revealed in our world, at the end of the day, it's considered like we are lacking. What are we lacking? We're lacking what we are accustomed to. We are lacking a dargan lakus that's shayich la'elamis. So that's the idea of Mamali and Seif, that both Mamali and Seif are considered Miliach Asardin. So then what's Ashirus? Says the Rebbe ends off the brackets. V'ini Ashir's the Meishu. What does it mean that Meishu was wealthy? The Neis, if Ashiru by Begili Agilim the Mali V'Seviv, here at Se Begili Gama Gil and Seif, Shalamayla Mishaychas La'ilamis. What does it mean that Meishu was spiritually wealthy? Not only did he have a revelation of Mamali and Seviv, he had a revelation by Meishu, was Meir, by Meishu was revealed. Meishu lived in the reality of Erin Seif. Shalamayla Mishaychas La'ilamis. Says Rebbe Vait, let's read a little bit more. Where do we find this idea? That Moshe was connected, that Moshe experienced the idea of spiritual wealth, the idea of Ashirus, of earning safe that's higher than having any Shaychas Leilamis. Okay, Mavur, about Maimer, like the Rebbe Rashab explains in his Maimer in Tafrish Samach, it's Mavur in the Maimer, the Rebbe Rashab's Maimer, that why was Moshe called an Usher? Why was he called wealthy? Because Moshe was living with the perspective of Das Elyon, which we'll explain in a second what that is. It says the Rebbe, Das Elyon, Das Tachtenu. What's the Maila? What's the advantage of Das Tachten, of Das Elyon over Das Tachten? Das Tachten mekabel mechitzenes hakeser arich seviv, and Das Elyon mekabel mepimis hakeser atik are in seif shalman begeder elamis. Says the Rebbe, what's the difference between Das Tachten and Das Elyon? Das Tachten is connected with arich, the lower level of keser, which arich, the lower level of keser, is Ur HaSeviv. That is associated with Ur HaSeviv. Das Elyon is connected with Atik, which Atik is the higher level of Keser, and that is the higher level of Keser, Atik, is connected with Erin Seif, that's L'maylim together Elamis. Let's take a minute to explain what this means. We know it's Mavur and Chassidus, many places. There's a concept called Das Tachtin and Das Elyon. It says in the Pasuk, Kel Deis Havaya. There are two perspectives in Elikus. The Eibishter. In Elikus, there are two ways how the Eibishter, two perspectives in Elikus, how the Eibishter looks at, views Elamis. Das Tachtin and Das Elyon. Das Tachtin is the idea of Lamata Yesh. Wherever you find in Chassidus, the idea of Das Tachtin, the lower perspective, will always be Lamata Yesh. That the world is, there's chashivos, there's importance, value, seen in Elamis. That's Das Tachtin. Lamata refers to the worlds. Lamata Yesh, there's value, there's importance to the world. That's Das Tachtin, the lower perspective. Das Elyon, the higher perspective, is Lamata Ayin. Lamata means the worlds. They're ayin. They're nothing. There's no value, no chashivas given to the worlds. These are the two perspectives in Elikus. One darga, the higher darga in Elikus, says Lamata ayin. The lower darga in Elikus says Lamata yesh. The question is, which dargas in Elikus are saying Lamata yesh, and which dargas in Elikus are saying Lamata ayin? This is where the sugya gets very confusing in Chassidus, because different places in Chassidus can say different explanations. Sometimes in Chassidus, we will say a certain darga says Lamata ayin, that the worlds are nothing, and another place in Chassidus will say that this same darga says Lamata yesh. What's the explanation? Why is it that in some places in Chassidus we're going to say that this darga says Lamata yesh, and in some places it's Lamata ayin? The answer to this is because everything's relative. Sometimes we say in Chassidus that, let's say if you just take an example, that arich, the level of Arich, which is the lower level of Keser, we know Keser has two dargas, Atik and Arich. So you'll say the lower level of Keser, Arich, says Lamata Ayin. Why are we saying that? Because in a certain sense, it's true that the level of Arich says that the world is batal. The world has no chashivas. But relative to a higher darga, even Arich gives some sort of chashivas to the world. So everything's relative. Here the Rebbe is saying, so that's in general. Chassidus in general, das Tachten, das Elyon, is a very relative concept. However, here the Rebbe is saying, what's the ultimate das Tachten and the ultimate das Elyon? The highest way of understanding das Elyon is connecting das Elyon to Atik. So as we were mentioning a bunch of times, in Keser represents in general the infinity of the Eibishter. However, in Keser, there are two dargas. There's Atik and Arich. Arich's the lower level, Atik's the higher level. And the ultimate level, das Elyon, the ultimate place in which we say, the ultimate expression of Lamata Ayin, the level in Alikus that says, that expresses the message of Lamata Ayin in the most true sense is Atik, the highest darga of Keser. The highest darga of Keser is the darga in Alikus that says Lamata Ayin, that the worlds are absolutely nothing and have no value at all. Anything that's lower than Atik, which would include Arich is the lower level of Keser. Anything that's lower than Atik doesn't convey the message of Das Elyon in its truest form, in its truest sense. Any level that's lower than Atik sees some sort of a value and gives some sort of a chashivos to Oilimus, and therefore the message of anything that's lower than Atik is Lamata Yesh, even in a subtle manner. It could be very subtle, but at the end of the day, anything that's lower than Atik conveys the message of Lamata Yesh. Says Rebbe, why is this? What's the explanation? Why is it that Arich is connected with Das Tachten, Lamata Yesh, and Atik is connected with Das Elyon, Lamata Ayin? The explanation is because Arich represents Ur HaSeviv, and Atik represents Atzmus, or the Ur that's even higher than Seviv. Therefore, based on what we just learned in the brackets, this should be very understood. Being that Arich represents Ur HaSeviv is a darga, is a shaykhis la'ilamis. You're right, Ur HaSeviv is not a makar, it's not a source for the ilamis, but at the end of the day, it's a darga, it's a reality in the kus that has some sort of a shaykhis, some sort of a connection. There's a conceptual idea of ilamis that exists even in the reality of Ur HaSeviv. And therefore, even from the perspective of Ur HaSeviv, we can't truly say Lamata Ayin. We can't say that the worlds are absolutely batal legabe relative to Ur HaSeviv, because Ur HaSeviv is a darga, a shaykhis leilamis. So Ur HaSeviv and Arich, which is connected with Ur HaSeviv, is still das Tachten, Lamata Yesh. However, where's the perspective? Where's the message of Lamata Ayin of das Elyon expressed clearly in Atik? Being that Atik is not Ur HaSeviv. Atik is higher than Ur HaSeviv. Atik is the Ur that's higher than having any shaykhis la'ilamis. It's higher than Geder Elamis. We could say, to simplify things, Atik is connected with Atzmus, with the essence of the Eibishter that's beyond the Mali and Seviv. So therefore, where's the message of Lamata Ayin fully expressed? Where's the perspective of Das Elyon exist in its purest form, specifically in Atik? And it's a mavur in Chassidus that Moshe Rabbeinu was living with Das Elyon. And again, what's Das Elyon? Atik. Or that's L'mayla Megeder Elamis. So if Moshe Rabbeinu was living here in this world with the perspective of Das Elyon, what does that mean? That Moshe was an usher. Moshe was wealthy. Moshe was living with the perspective of Atzmus, of the that's L'mayla Megeder Elamis. That's the perspective that Moshe Rabbeinu was living with. So that's what it means that Moshe was an usher. What does it mean that Moshe was an usher? That Moshe was living with the perspective of Das Elyon. He was living with the message, the ultimate message of Lamata Ayin. The message of Lamata Ayin, the way this message exists in the earth. It's L'mayla Megeder Shaychas Leilamis. L'mayla Megeder Elamis. And that's what it means that Moshe was an usher. So in summary, what we just learned is that there's three dargas. Memali, Seif, and Atzmus. Memali represents the first level of aniyus and ashiras that a person has his basic and essential needs. Or Seif represents the second level, that a person has more than his basic and essential needs. He has anything that he's accustomed to. But what's ashiros? Atzmus. Or the that's l'mayla megeder elamis. The that's l'mayla mishaychas le'elamis. And that's the idea of Das Elyon. Why was Moshe Rabbeinu an usher? Why do we say that Moshe was wealthy? Why is Moshe's tefillah called tefillas usher? Why are we saying that Moshe is referred to an usher? Because Moshe lived with Das Elyon. Moshe lived with the perspective of the earth, the L'mayla Megeder Elamis, the earth that's higher than Mamali and Seviv. In other words, Moshe had a ribe hashpa, he had an abundance. And that's why he's called an Asher Baruchnius. And again, being that he was Asher Baruchnius, that was the cause for why he wasn't Asher Begashmis. So based on all of this, the Rebbe ends off. Appease the tzarich lavin oid yes in the tefillah Moshe tefillas Asher. Hari in a tefillah Chukas baruch malas machseidei v'kev and shemoshe Asher. Him begashmis him baruchnis. Hari loyd actually haya chaser b'peil shum davar el shalei shayich etzel inach sardin umau in a tefillah shaloi. So this strengthens the question that we asked in the first paragraph of Seif. In the first paragraph of Seif, the Rebbe Rashab asked, what does it mean that Moshe has a tefillah? What does it mean that Moshe has a request? Tefillah means you're asking the Eibush to provide you with your needs. But Moshe is wealthy, he's rich, he doesn't have any needs. That was the question we asked in the beginning of Seif. Now the Rebbe strengthened this question based on explaining that not only does a rich person mean that he's not lacking anything, a rich person means more than you're not lacking. A rich person means that you're mushba beribui. A rich person, a wealthy person means a person has abundance. Not only is he not lacking anything, he has more than not lacking. He has an abundance. So if Moshe Rabbeinu is a true Asher, which means not only he's not lacking anything, but he has an abundance, so what does it mean that Moshe is davening? What could he be davening for? He's not lacking anything. That's the question of the Rebbe Rashab. What does it mean that Moshe is has a tefillas Asher? How could it be that an Asher, someone that's mushba b'ribe hashpa, someone has abundance, how could it be that he has a tefillah, he has a prayer? Now, in Sivav, the Rebbe is going to go on to bringing the Nekudas Habir of the Rebbe Rashab's Maimer. The Rebbe is going to bring the Nekudas Habir. The Nekudas Habir is the synopsis, so to speak, of the Rebbe Rashab, the explanation that the Rebbe Rashab gives in his Maimer to this question. The question we just asked. What does it mean that Moshe Rabbeinu has a tefillah? So the Rebbe is going to bring the beer, the Nekudas Habir of the Rebbe Rashab's Maimer. And then the Rebbe is going to go here in Sivav, and Siv Zayin, Siv Ches, etc., and add layers upon layers of depth to this beer of the Rebbe Rashab's Maimer. Let's see the Nekudas Habir. Let's see the beginning of Sivav inside. Nekudas Habir b'zeh Maimer. The tefillas Asher hiloi b'shvil atzmei ela b'shvil Knesset Yisrael. This is the Nekudas Habir. The Rebbe Rashab says there's two types of tefillas. Some people, tefillas ani, someone that's a poor person, someone that's lacking, can daven for himself. And what's a tefillas Asher? What does it mean that a rich person, what does it mean that a wealthy person has a tefillah? What's he asking? What's his request? He's not asking for himself because he's not lacking anything. On the contrary, someone that is an Asher is mushba b'ribe hashpa. He has an abundance. So what's he asking for? He's asking for somebody else. The tefillah of an Asher is not for himself, but for the tefillah of Moshe, for Knesset Yisrael. And we find this idea in the Medrash, get the East of the Medrash al pasuk tefillah Moshe. Mosh lamad davar deimeh. Shloish shabo little meis hamelech. Bo hashlishi amr le hamelech mat mevakesh amr lei ein mevakesh al atzmi davar el medina plainis hicharevav hishalcha gzar shetibane kach Moshe le bikesh la atzmi el b'shli Yisrael. The Medrash says on this pasuk tefillah Moshe that Moshe's tefillah is unique. The Medrash brings over there other people that we find they daven to the Eibishter. The Medrash brings the tefillah of David HaMelech and the tefillah of Habakkuk. And the Medrash says that David and Habakkuk were all davening for themselves. So this can be compared to a person that comes to the king. The king, he gets an appointment to meet the king, and the king asks him, what do you want? And the person goes ahead and asks the king for forgiveness, or asks the king to give him whatever, something that he's lacking, something that he needs. That's with regards to the tefillah of David and Habakkuk. However, Moshe Rabbeinu, the king, asks him, what do you want? So Moshe starts telling him, he doesn't ask for himself. It's like the person that comes to the king, like the mashal that the Medrash gives. A person comes to the king and says, there's a medina plainis v'chareva v'hishalcha. There's a certain city that is destroyed, and this city belongs to you. I'm asking of you, the king, that you should make a decree that this city should be rebuilt. So to Moshe Rabbeinu, in the tefillah Moshe, when we say Moshe is the tefillah, Moshe Rabbeinu's tefillah is not about himself. He's not asking for his own needs, for his own forgiveness. Rather, Moshe asks, Slach na laveina amazeh. Moshe Rabbeinu asks for the Yidden's forgiveness. He doesn't ask anything for himself, he asks for the Yidden. This is what the Medrash says on the pasuk tefillah Moshe. So based on the Maimer of the Rebbe Rashab, this Medrash is very understood. Simply, it's not so understood. Why is the Medrash connecting Tefillah Moshe to the idea of that Moshe asked that the Yidden should be forgiven? What's the connection between Tefillah Moshe and Slach na laveina amazeh? But based on what the Rebbe Rashab was saying here, it's very, very understood. Moshe Rabbeinu, like it says in the Zohar, the tefillah of a Moshe is a tefillas Asher. Moshe is an Asher. So he has nothing to daven for. He doesn't have his own needs. He doesn't have his own requests. So what's his tefillah? So now based on this, we understand what the Medrash is saying. The Medrash is telling us, you're right, he doesn't have his own request. He's asking for the Yidden. He's davening on behalf of the Yidden. And that is the Nekudas Abir of the Rebbe Shab's Maimer. What is a tefillas Asher? Tefillas Asher is that an Asher is davening for somebody else. Says the Rebbe, right there, let's go a little bit right there inside Sivav, L'chayda, Bi or Zeh, Tzarech L'Bi or Yosef. L'fi Hanal, Hatfila Sha'asher Mispalel B'Shvil Achedim, Ein Shayeches La'Shir Shalei. D'Zeh Shu Mispalel B'Shvil Achedim, Hu B'Pnei Shu Reitz B'Tei Vasam. Pirush Tfilas Asher B'Pashtos, Hu Shatfila Shalei, Hu B'Pnei Shu Asher. Says the Rebbe, we can still ask, and we still need further clarification in what exactly a tefillas Asher is. What is a tefillas Asher? In Seif, the Rebbe Shab's question is, how could an Asher even daven? How is it even possible for an Asher to daven? So that we answered in the beginning of Sivav. He's able to daven. He's not davening for his own needs. He's not davening that the Eibusher should provide him with what he's lacking, because he's not lacking anything. Rather, the Asher is davening for somebody else. So that's the answer to the Rebbe Shab's question. But the Rebbe is saying, we could take the question a step further. At the end of the day, we're calling the tefillah of Moshe Rabbeinu a tefillah of an Asher. It's the type of a tefillah that an Asher davens. In other words, it sounds like that the tefillah, the request, is connected and as a result of him being an Asher, of Moshe Rabbeinu being an Asher. And singly, this still needs to be understood. This still needs to be explained. Why is Moshe davening for the Yidden? Why is he davening for the Yidden? He's not davening for the Yidden because he's an Asher. He's davening for the Yidden because he cares for the good, for the benefit of the Yidden. That's why he's davening for the Yidden. In other words, even if Moshe wasn't an Asher, seemingly he would be able to daven this tefillah. The only thing that's unique about Moshe is that Moshe has nothing else to daven about. Moshe has no personal needs. Being that he's an Asher, he has no personal needs, so he has nothing else to daven about. That's true. The only thing he could daven for is for somebody else. But even if you weren't an Asher, if you care about somebody else, you could daven for them. So in other words, this tefillah, the fact that Moshe is davening for Yidden, is seemingly not a direct result of the fact that he's an Asher. Again, being that he's an Asher, he has nothing else to daven for. So if you're an Asher, you can only daven for somebody else. But it's not true to say, seemingly, that you can only daven for somebody else if you're an Asher. I'll say that again. An Asher can only daven for somebody else. But seemingly it's not true to say that you can only daven for somebody else if you're an Asher. So why are we calling it a tefillas Asher? At the end of the day, this is the Rebbe's new question. At the end of the day, the tefillah of Moshe should not be called a tefillas Asher. Because what does the tefillah have to do with his Asherus? What does this request have to do with his wealth? You can have this request seemingly even if you're not wealthy. And that's the Rebbe's new question that the Rebbe is going to deal with here in the Hemshech of Sivav. And once the Rebbe deals with this question in the next paragraph of Sivav, this is going to be a gateway. This is going to open up to a whole new discussion in the Maamer in Siv Zayin Ches and Weiter. Now, in order to answer this question and explain the connection between this tefillah and the Asherus, the wealth of Moshe, the Rebbe is first going to go on to explain in this next paragraph of Sivav what exactly is Moshe's tefillah. In other words, we know that a tefillah l'Moshe, tefillas Asher, is a tefillah for somebody else. But what is he davening for somebody else? What is he asking on behalf of the Yidden? Moshe is davening for the Yidden. We know that. An Asher only davens for somebody else. So Moshe is davening for the Yidden. But what exactly is he asking? What exactly is he davening for on behalf of the Yidden? So we know, the Medrash says, that Moshe can be compared to a person that is coming to the Melech and is saying that there's a Medina plainness, there's a certain country, a certain city, and Vichareva, the city is destroyed. Gzar Shetibana. This person is asking the king to rebuild this Medina, this city, this country. That is the request of Tefillah Moshe. So the Rebbe in this next paragraph, Sivav, is going to go on to explain what exactly is this Medina. Which country, which city are we referring to? What is this Medina? What does it mean that the Medina is Chareva? What does it mean that the city is destroyed? And what is Moshe's request that the city should be rebuilt? Once the Rebbe is going to explain this tefillah, the tefillah of Moshe, once we will have a proper understanding of what exactly it is that Moshe is davening for, What is this Medina? What does it mean that's destroyed? What does it mean that Moshe is asking that this Medina should be rebuilt? When we will have a proper understanding of the tefillah of Moshe, we will also understand what exactly is the connection between this unique tefillah and the Ashiros, the wealth of Moshe Rabbeinu. But to read the next paragraph inside, we will leave for the following Shiur in Be'ezus Hashem.